Detective Recap here. Today, I'm going to explain a horror drama film called MOEBIUS. The horror part of the film comes from severed manhoods while the drama part comes from the grief over the severed manhoods. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. One morning, a family is at home. The disheveled mother is sitting on top of the stairs and drinking her wine while the father and the son sit downstairs. All of a sudden, the father's mistress calls him on his phone, making his wife rush to him, desperately trying to take the phone. The two struggle for the phone, kicking each other while the son watches from the side. Eventually, the father takes his phone back, then walks outside to speak to his mistress. Later on, the father arrives to pick up his mistress at a convenience store, and the two go out for a date. Sometime after, the son finds his father's car parked, and he's fooling around with his mistress inside the vehicle. From the other side of the car, the mother also watches with rage-filled eyes. Afterwards, the father drives his mistress back to the convenience store. Inside, the mother looks at the father first before checking on her son, who's inside his room, touching himself. Afterwards, the mother takes a knife from the kitchen and makes her way to the father's room. She attempts to castrate him, but the father ends up awake. He quickly fights off the mother until he manages to kick her out of the room. For some reason, the father thinks that the suitable course of action here is to lock the door and leave his clearly unstable wife on the floor with her knife. Granted, it's hard to imagine what to do after almost facing castration, so maybe we can cut the father some slack. As she picks herself up, the mother decides to move to her son's room, planning the same thing she wanted to do to the father. This time, the mother tearfully successfully castrates her son, and she holds onto the torn member while her poor son screams in agony. The father hears this and rushes to his son's room, finding the mother there, smiling wickedly at him while their son screams from his bed. The mother then shoves her son's torn manhood into her mouth and eats it as the father watches in horror. He pins her down, trying to make her spit it out, but the mother starts biting at his fingers instead. Shaking, the mother suddenly collapses to the ground, so the father takes his son away from the house. After the incident, the mother walks into the streets, dazed, while thinking about what she just did. After all, the mother never resented her son. There were even times when she doted on him. But when she failed to sever the father's member, slicing her son's off was the next best thing for her. Being his father's only son, castrating him was akin to a symbolically castrating the father. Along the streets, the mother finds a man praying to a statue inside a store. She watches him until he finishes before following him. Meanwhile, the father takes his son to a hospital to get him treated. After the doctors tend to him, the son is now able to walk, and the two return home. The father's mistress suddenly calls him, but he ignores this as he opens a drawer, where he finds his gun. He then aims it at his manhood before stopping and putting the gun back on the table. After a while, the father goes to a clinic to get a vasectomy. Later on, the father and son are in their car when the mistress stops them. As she approaches, the father locks the door and ignores her despite her knocking. He drives away, leaving his mistress disheartened. Now in school, the son tries to urinate when one of the students in the school notices him struggling. After school, the student gathers his friends and together, they corner the son in an alley. They start removing his pants, and upon seeing his lack of manhood, the students cruelly laugh on. Suddenly, the father rushes to his boy and slaps one of the students as they disperse. This gives the father some space to check up on his son. However, the students rush to the father, beating him up while the son just fixes himself up, ashamed of what just happened. After the father recovered, the two then drive home. When they arrive, the father tries to check up on his son and dote on him, but the still humiliated boy pushes him away and throws his jacket to the floor. Naturally, the father is plagued by guilt over what happened. Since his actions gave his wife the wrath to do this, he may as well be the blade she used to sever their son's member. Later that day, the son walks to the convenience store where his father's mistress is and watches her as she fixes some shelves. The two then stare at each other for a while before the mistress starts removing her top, revealing her bare chest to him. The son then walks closer, touching the mistress, and in turn, she tries to touch the son. However, the son ends up moving away and leaving, feeling ashamed of himself while the mistress is left alone in the store to get back to work. If you think that the mistress and the mother look similar, that's because they're played by the same actress. This could be to save the producer some money, or this could be because the mistress now parallels the neglected mother. Like her, she wanted something from the father, and because she couldn't get it from him, she sought it in his son. Later on, the son returns to the convenience store and finds the mistress drinking alone, when suddenly, the group of students finds him again, forcing him to come out and humiliate himself once more. With no choice but to oblige, the son walks out of the store. The students are starting to remove his pants again when a gang suddenly comes up to them. They kick one of the guys off the son before beating up the rest of the students. Afterwards, the group runs away while the gang checks on the son. The gang leader then stares at the mistress as she looks back, thankful for their intervention. The gang now stays outside the convenience store, drinking some liquor while hanging out with the son. A few minutes later, the gang leader spots the mistress fixing the shelves again, so he and his gang enter the store, and soon enough, the leader takes the mistress to a room while the rest of the goons stops the son from interfering. Inside the room, the gang leader forces himself onto the mistress, and she could only cry in distress. Outside, the rest of the gang just listens and waits until the gang leader leaves the room, then takes turns forcing themselves on the mistress. When they let the son inside, he finds the mistress on the floor in tears. Unfeeling, he mounts the woman and under the watchful gazes of the gang members outside, he humps her. It was made clear that the son wasn't on board with the mistress being violated since he initially tried to stop the gang leader. But in the end, the son chose to force himself on a woman to keep his standing among his male peers and to keep himself from being further emasculated. Perhaps this was even his own way of reclaiming his masculinity. Back at home, the father painstakingly researches genital transplants and is disappointed to find an article claiming it's not possible. Then, he starts researching about climaxing and how his son could experience this. Suddenly, someone knocks at the door, revealing it to be the police. The policemen storm inside and arrest the son for what happened in the convenience store. In the station, the father tries to convince the policeman that his son couldn't have done it, so he tries to show his son's manhood. As his father tries to remove his pants, the mortified son kicks him off. Furious, he starts beating his father while the gang and the policemen watch. It's a wonder why the father had to make a spectacle out of removing his son's pants in front of everyone. They could have done it in private, they could have gotten a doctor's note, or something. Anything. Really, the father deserved every bit of kicking he got for his zero sense of judgment. Shortly after, the policemen pull the son away from his father to remove the son's pants themselves. Desperately trying to escape, the son tries to kick them away, but the policemen successfully take off his pants, revealing the son's secret. Upon seeing this, the gang laughs while the policemen look on in awe. After that, the policemen let the son go, but he quickly attacks the gang leader for laughing at him before he is pulled away again. His pants slightly loose, the father tries to fix his son's pants, but the son just kicks him down again before crying in shame and humiliation. As he arrives home, the father walks upstairs again and contemplates shooting himself in the head. He doesn't go through with it, and instead, he cries on the desk while lamenting over what they have to go through now. After this, the father continues with his research, still trying to learn more about a person's private parts and how arousal works. Through this, the father discovers that arousal stimulation is closely tied with pain as the two work hand in hand. He then tests it out with a rock on his foot but fails to find this arousing since he just ends up hurting himself. This may be another instance of the father showcasing his poor judgment. He chose to go straight to seeking pleasure from a rock when touching his posterior was a more viable first option. But perhaps the father didn't want his son to feel even more emasculated than he already was. Back in prison, the son is moved to his jail cell. One of the prisoners tries to mess with him, but the son grabs the prisoner's arm and throws it back at him. Later that night, while the son is trying to sleep, the prisoners gang up to violate him. They're removing his pants when suddenly, the guard arrives, stopping them at once. The guard then moves the son into an isolated cell, where he can sit alone, finally unbothered. Back at home, the father repeats the test by rubbing the rock on his foot, and he keeps on going until he finally climaxes, validating his experiment. When he checks on his manhood, the father also feels the pain coming from his feet, and he ends up screaming and breathing heavily as he desperately grabs onto them. In the morning, the father visits his son again to give him a piece of paper. When he returns to his cell, the son reads his father's findings before crumpling the paper and throwing it away. The son then spends the rest of the day thinking about what his father had given him before taking the paper again, spreading it out as he rereads its contents. After reading, the son chips a rock off the wall and proceeds to rub it against his arm, not stopping until he starts wounding himself. Despite being in intense pain, he continues and eventually reaches his climax, finally slowing down as he finishes. He then lies down in satisfaction, only to be hit by the pain in his arm. Back home, the father continues to research about transplants that his son can go through. The next day, the son is released from jail, so his father picks him up. It isn't clear what the son's charges are. But if he's there for participating in the mistress's violation, then it's a wonder why he's set free so quickly. The father asks if he tried pleasuring himself, and the son nods in confirmation. On their way home, the son passes by the convenience store and sees the mistress. The two lock eyes for a few seconds before the son walks back to their house. Inside, the son tries to pleasure himself again, rubbing a rock against his foot this time. While he's enjoying himself, his father checks on him for a second before leaving his son to his business. When the son finishes, he feels the pain again, but his father suddenly comes in to treat his wounds. As twisted as their dynamic has become, this tragedy has still become a way for the two to grow closer with each other. The day after, the father and son share a meal before heading upstairs to read about successful transplants. At first, the two are excited by what they're reading, but they grow slightly disheartened when they see the side effects. Later on, the son returns to the convenience store where the mistress is, waiting to strike him with a kitchen knife. When the son arrives inside, he kneels in front of her and she stabs him by the shoulder while furiously looking at him. Unfazed, the son just stares back before he tries touching the mistress, but the mistress stops him by slapping him across his face. However, she starts to whisper something to him and they both nod in agreement. Afterwards, the mistress undresses while the son starts pleasuring himself using the knife stuck near his shoulder. He moves it around, softly moaning in pain before going faster. The mistress then takes hold of the knife, moving it for the son, who then starts touching the mistress in her privates. The two pleasure each other until they climax together. After sharing a kiss, she finally removes the knife from his shoulder. Later that day, the mistress waits outside the prison until the gang leader is freed. Again, it's odd why literal assailants immediately let free, and it's even odder that he's happy to see the woman who turned him in. But perhaps the mistress withdrew her charges, and she had her eyes set on a more vicious vengeance. From there, the two walk back to the convenience store for some drinks while the son carefully tails them. As they drink, the gang leader starts making his move on the mistress, kissing her on the side, but the mistress soon pins him down to the floor, staying on top of the gang leader while the son enters the room. The mistress then takes the knife she used on the son earlier, and with the son taking his turn to pin the gang leader down, the mistress starts castrating him. She then stabs the gang leader one more time before standing up. The son runs away from the store while holding the gang leader's manhood, forcing the leader to give chase. He tries to take back his manhood, but the son throws it onto the streets, where cars are driving by. Shouting in pain, the gang leader tries to reach for his manhood, but the son stops him, and he's forced to watch his manhood get run over by a truck. After that horrific sight, the leader heads back to the convenience store, where he finds the mistress seated by the door while enjoying some liquor. He then starts beating her up for what she did to him, but the son walks up from behind and stabs him by the shoulder. The son then shakes the knife, pleasuring the gang leader with pain. The three move in an odd, sensual synchrony until the gang leader reaches his climax. This should go down as the most bizarre three-way ever conceived. Still, it's a mystery why the mistress was willing to pleasure the men who took advantage of her. The gang leader, especially. But in a story that's peppered with the most unhinged ways of reclaiming sensuality, this may be her way of reclaiming her own along with her power. Or perhaps she's just a deeply troubled and lonely woman. Now back at home, the son and his father are reading about transplants again when they come across an article discussing a successful one. The two smile at each other before the father answers a call and goes outside. From the window, the son stares on as his overjoyed father looks back at him, still with a smile. Later, the son finally has his transplant in an operating room. After the operation, the doctor has him watch some explicit videos to no avail as his new manhood isn't reacting to them. Later that day, the son goes to the mistress to show her the unsuccessful fruit of his operation. She tries to touch and play with it, but nothing happens, so the flaccid son walks back home. At their house, they hear a sudden knock at the door, and the father and son are surprised to see the mother there. To their shock, the mother casually enters their home, then walks inside one of the rooms to sleep on the bed. The father and son just stare at her while she sleeps before leaving her to rest. That night, when the father and son are asleep in bed together, the mother comes to check on them. She joins them in bed, squeezing between her husband and son, then pushing the father off the bed. As the son opens his eyes, his mother stares back at him, holding his face and kissing his forehead gently to soothe him. It was truly as if nothing happened. The mother behaves as if she never mutilated her own son's member. She just goes on to dote at him and coddle him as a mother would, perhaps as a way to piece her broken family together. To the son's surprise, however, his manhood starts standing up while he stares at his mother. His father also sees this, and the sight sends him to a shock. With all of them still in awe, the mother begins checking on the father, and she's stunned when she realizes that the father's now castrated, too, and the manhood that her son now has belonged to him. Shock fills the room, and the son runs outside, still taken aback by what his manhood had done and in his mother's presence, no less. Back inside the room, the father kneels before the mother, crying as he's struck with guilt and regret over his infidelity. While he starts hugging her, though, he takes a stone from the desk beside him and starts rubbing it onto his hand. Confused, the mother stops him before he could continue and pushes him away. With that, she leaves the room. Outside, the mother sees her son getting ready to leave the house. She tries to hold him, but the son slaps her hand away before leaving for the convenience store. Upon his arrival, he immediately goes to the mistress, and the two hook up. However, the son suddenly stops and zips his pants back up. The mistress grabs his hand, and the two share a kiss before the son walks out the door. She then cries when the son peeks back inside, and after staring coldly at her, he leaves. In a way, the mistress has no true place in the father and the son's life. The father doesn't even acknowledge her presence anymore. And the son, whose member was once his father's, can only grow hard around his mother. When the son returned home, the mother greets him, unzips his pants, and reveals a part of her chest to him. With the son staring at her, the father catches sight of this, so he goes and slaps the both of them, prompting his son to walk away back to his room and lock the door. The mother tries to catch up to him, but the father grabs her arm, stopping her. She manages to make her husband let go of her, and she walks to her son's door, knocking first. Inside, the son deliberates whether he should let his mother in before finally deciding to unlock the door. Just as the mother hears the door unlock, she tries walking in only for the father to stop her again. Annoyed, she pushes him off and continues to make her way to her son's room. Once inside, the mother sits beside her son while he lies down on the bed. Then, she puts her hand inside his sheets and starts to touch him, pleasuring him and going faster when she sees her son getting more stimulated. The son covers his face with his sheets, then reaches out for her so he could touch her as well. With the father listening from outside, the mother starts crying as they continue with their messed up business until the son eventually finishes. Afterwards, the mother tidies up his bed then leaves the room. To check if his mother's gone, the son peeks from outside his blanket, only to cry by himself while he thinks about what they had just done. Still listening, the father stares at the mother in disgust as she cries while still listening to their son's cries from his room. It's an endless bout of crying from the family. No matter how hard they try, they're ruined. And all the mother's attempts at atonement through being her son's release only plunges them deeper in the horror show they're trapped in. Having had enough, the father slaps his wife, who then slaps him back. The father grabs the knife that the mother castrated his son with before heading inside the son's room. He attempts to castrate him again, but both the mother and son fend off his efforts, choking him and grabbing his arm until he's forced to let the knife go. There was nothing for the family to do but cry together, sobbing as they ponder how ruined their family has become. That same night, the gang leader makes his way back to the convenience store and hands the mistress a knife. She takes it and helps the gang leader pleasure himself by stabbing his shoulder again. As the mistress and the gang leader do it, the son walks in and watches them. Seeing the son, the mistress smiles at him before he eventually leaves. Right after that, the gang leader reaches his climax. Back in the house, the father is on the table upstairs, playing with a golf club. Though the father was more than ready to give up his manhood for his son, he just couldn't accept that his wife is now engaging with their son in such an absurd manner. This has served to be the true castration for him. His son now has both his manhood and his wife. The mother is in another room, putting on lipstick and getting herself ready for her son, who's in his room while waiting for his mother to come. With the father watching helplessly from outside, the mother enters her son's room and immediately undresses. The son just stares at her while she approaches him when suddenly, the father walks in and carries his wife outside to a different room, trying to force himself on her. The two fight each other as the mother tries to push the father away while the son enters the room to watch them. Finally, the mother manages to kick the father off of her while the father angrily stares back. Later, the father and the mother are now upstairs again, and the father loads bullets into his gun before aiming it at the mother. She coldly stares back then stands up to leave the room, but the father holds the gun to her head. Together, they walk downstairs one step at a time. All throughout their fights and their struggles against each other, the mother never showed anything but spite towards the father. At this point, she seems to care little for her own life, but she cares for her husband a lot less. In the son's dream, the mother returns to his room and makes love to him while the father watches from outside. Suddenly, the father fires his gun, waking the son up from his sleep, so he immediately checks on his manhood. When he finds it wet, he breathes a sigh of relief before walking out of his room. However, a horrifying sight greets him, and he falls to the ground while seeing the bodies of his parents by the stairs. As he stares back at his dead parents, the son takes the gun and aims it at his manhood, breathing in, and eventually, he shoots it off. After that night, the son walks along the streets and finds a shop with religious statues in it. Surprisingly, the son looks exactly like the man in the streets that his mother saw the night she left their home. And just like the man, the son then starts praying and getting on his knees before bowing one last time. When he finishes, the son smiles coldly. A MOEBIUS strip looks like an infinite loop, and it's a one-sided surface with no orientation. And as if they were in a MOEBIUS strip, all the characters are stuck and doomed to stay in a macabre loop. The son continues to shoulder the failed brutalities against his father. When his mother failed to castrate him, the son was castrated in his stead. When the father failed to shoot his manhood off, the son did it when his father's member became his. The mistress remains in her own limbo, where the only reason anyone comes to her is for their own pleasure. From the father, to the son, and to the gang leader, she's only there to get used by them. As for the mother, she followed a praying stranger after dismembering her son. But the ending suggested that the stranger was her son all along. Whether it was her son symbolically or literally, there was no escape for the mother, and there was no escape for anyone. Only the son, who in a moment of tranquility shed any carnal pursuits to pray, was able to smile triumphantly. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.